Picture this: the sun sets behind towering stone walls, casting long shadows over a city braced for battle. The air is thick with tension, the distant rumble of marching feet growing louder by the minute. Behind those walls, families huddle together, their fate resting on the shoulders of a few determined souls. This is the moment when history hangs in the balance, when the courage of one person can mean the difference between survival and ruin. Across centuries, from the dust of ancient battlefields to the smoldering ruins of medieval strongholds, there are stories of defenders who stood firm against overwhelming odds, whose names echo through time, not just for their strength, but for their unyielding resolve. These aren't just tales of war, they're testaments to the human spirit, to the power of strategy, loyalty, and sheer willpower in the face of despair. Think about what it takes to look at an army 10 times your size and refuse to back down, to stare into the jaws of certain defeat and still find a way to outthink, outlast, and outfight the enemy. The defenders we're about to meet didn't just save bricks and mortar, they preserved cultures, traditions, and entire ways of life. Some were kings and generals, their names etched in history books. Others were ordinary citizens, farmers, or artisans who stepped forward when no one else would. Their weapons weren't always swords or arrows. Sometimes it was cunning, ingenuity, or even a well-timed act of defiance that turned the tide. These are the stories that remind us why we still tell tales of sieges centuries later, because they're not just about battles, but about people who refused to let their world crumble. So let's step into their shoes for a moment, feel the weight of their decisions, the stakes of their choices. What would you do if everything you loved was on the line? Over the next 20 accounts, you'll witness the brilliance of commanders who outwitted entire armies, the sacrifice of soldiers who held the line when all seemed lost, and the quiet heroism of those whose names history almost forgot. From the walls of Constantinople to the gates of Vienna, these defenders didn't just fight, they inspired. And their legacies live on, not just in the cities they saved, but in the timeless truth that courage, no matter the era, can reshape destiny. Ready to meet them? Then let's begin. Sieges weren't just about armies clashing outside city walls. They were high-stakes games of survival where time, hunger, and sheer desperation were as deadly as any sword. Picture a medieval city. Its walls weren't just stone and mortar, but the heartbeat of an entire civilization. Inside, generations of knowledge, art, and tradition thrived. Outside, an enemy waited, not just to conquer land, but to erase a way of life. That's why sieges became the ultimate test of human resilience. A city under siege wasn't just fighting for its walls, it was fighting for its future. What made these standoffs so pivotal? For starters, they were battles of wits as much as strength. Defenders had to outthink their opponents, using every trick in the book, from pouring boiling oil on attackers to digging secret tunnels for surprise strikes. Meanwhile, invaders had to break not just gates but spirits. The longer a siege dragged on, the more it became a war of nerves. Would the city's food run out first, or would the attacking army lose patience and retreat? Either way, the defenders' ability to endure could shift the course of history. Take the famous stand at Rhodes, where a handful of knights held off an empire for months, buying time for allies to rally. Or the siege of Orléans, where one young woman's defiance turned the tide of an entire war. But the real genius of these defenses often lay in the unseen details. Ever heard of countermining? When attackers dug tunnels to collapse city walls, defenders would dig their own tunnels to intercept them. Underground battles in pitch darkness. And then there were the psychological tactics. Defenders might launch fireworks from the walls to mimic divine intervention, or spread rumors of plague inside to deter invaders. Every siege was a masterclass in creativity where desperation bred brilliance, and let's not forget the ripple effects. A city that withstood a siege didn't just survive, it sent a message. Neighboring rulers took note, alliances shifted. The morale of entire regions could soar or crumble based on one city's defiance. That's why these stories still resonate today. They're not just about who won or lost, but about how ordinary people, pushed to their limits, found extraordinary ways to protect what mattered most. So as we explore these 20 defenses, remember, you're not just hearing war stories, you're uncovering the moments when ingenuity, courage, and stubbornness changed the world. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem was just 16 years old when he faced his greatest test, a test that would define his reign and change the course of history. Already battling the ravages of leprosy, a disease that slowly eroded his body, he now stood against an even graver threat, Saladin's vast army sweeping across the Holy Land with one goal: to crush the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The year was 1177, and the odds were impossible. Baldwin's forces were outnumbered nearly 5-1, his knights exhausted, his resources stretched thin. Yet when messengers brought word that Saladin's troops were vulnerable near Montgisard, the young king made a decision that would echo through the ages. He would attack. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in courage and cunning. Baldwin, though barely able to grip a sword due to his illness, rode at the head of his cavalry, his face hidden behind a silver mask to shield his disfigured features. But his mind was sharp, his strategy flawless. He exploited the terrain, using the marshy ground to disrupt Saladin's cavalry charges. He timed his assault perfectly, catching the enemy off guard as they crossed a river, their formations in disarray. The result, a crushing defeat for one of the greatest military leaders of the era. Saladin himself barely escaped, fleeing on a pack camel while his army scattered behind him. But Baldwin's triumph wasn't just about tactics, it was about symbolism. Here was a king who refused to let his body's weakness define his strength. Leprosy might have stolen his health, but it couldn't touch his resolve. His victory at Montgisard bought Jerusalem precious time, halting Saladin's advance and rallying Christian forces across the region. It was a lesson in leadership that transcended the battlefield. True power lies not in the sword arm, but in the will to stand when others would flee. And yet, Baldwin's story is also one of heartbreaking irony. The very disease that made his victory so inspiring would cut his life short at just 24. But in those few years, he proved that greatness isn't measured in longevity, it's measured in moments. Moments like Montgisard, where a teenager, his body failing him, outthought and outfought a legend. His legacy isn't just a battle one, it's a reminder that the fiercest sieges aren't always fought with walls and weapons, but with the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to surrender. Now imagine a 17-year-old peasant girl, dressed in armor she'd never worn before, standing before the weary commanders of a broken French army. The year was 1429, and the English siege of Orléans had dragged on for months, starving the city and crushing French morale. The war had already lasted nearly a century, generations of defeat, betrayal, and dwindling hope. Then came Joan, an illiterate farm girl who claimed saints spoke to her in visions, urging her to lead France to victory. To the nobles, she must have seemed like a madwoman. To the soldiers, she was either a miracle or a joke. Yet within weeks, this unlikely figure would do what seasoned generals couldn't. She would break the siege and change history. What made Joan so extraordinary wasn't just her audacity. It was her ability to transform despair into action. Arriving at Orléans in April, she didn't waste time debating strategy in dimly lit war rooms. She rode straight to the front lines, her banner flying high, rallying troops who'd long forgotten what it meant to believe in victory. Her tactics defied convention. When tradition said besieged forces should conserve energy, she ordered relentless nighttime attacks, catching the English off guard. When hesitation might have cost momentum, she led charges herself, once even scaling a siege ladder under a hail of arrows to plant her flag on an enemy fort. And it worked. In just 9 days, the English defenses crumbled, their once impenetrable positions overrun by soldiers who'd rediscovered their courage in the shadow of a teenage girl. But Joan's real weapon wasn't her sword, it was her unshakable certainty. In an age where war was as much about psychology as steel, her conviction became contagious. She spoke of divine favor not as a vague hope, but as a fact. When she told the troops God willed their victory, they believed her. Even her enemies hesitated, some English soldiers later admitting they'd feared her as a witch. Yet behind the legend was a keen tactical mind. She recognized the English siege forts were isolated, cut off from each other by the Loire River, and exploited it, attacking them one by one instead of facing their combined strength. By the time she entered Orléans in triumph, the city's bells ringing for the first time in months, she'd proven that faith and strategy could be unstoppable allies. The aftermath of Orléans rippled far beyond its walls. Joan's victory reignited French nationalism, paving the way for the coronation of Charles VII and ultimately France's resurgence in the 100 Years' War. But her legacy is deeper than battlefields. She shattered every expectation of her era. Peasants didn't command armies, women didn't wear armor, and saints certainly didn't speak to farm girls. Yet she refused to be bound by what others deemed impossible. Even her eventual capture and execution couldn't erase what she'd proven, that a single voice, armed with enough conviction, can rally an entire nation. Centuries later, her story still asks us, what might we dare if we stopped listening to doubters, even the ones inside our own heads? Constantinople in 1453 was a city of ghosts. Once the glittering heart of an empire that spanned continents, its walls now echoed with the footsteps of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, as he prepared for an ending he knew was coming. The Ottomans, led by the ambitious young Sultan Mehmed II, had surrounded the city with an army numbering in the tens of thousands. Their cannons, some so massive they took weeks to transport, had already begun pounding the ancient Theodosian walls, each blast shaking the foundations of a civilization that had stood for over 1,000 years. Inside, Constantine commanded fewer than 7,000 defenders, many of them foreign mercenaries or terrified civilians. The math was brutal, the outcome seemed certain. Yet when Mehmed offered him safe passage in exchange for surrender, the emperor's reply was unforgettable. To surrender the city is beyond my authority or anyone else's. Let it be understood that I will die defending it. What followed wasn't just a siege, it was the last act of a world. Constantine, though a ruler with little military experience, proved astonishingly resourceful. He ordered chains stretched across the Golden Horn to block Ottoman ships, forcing Mehmed's engineers to drag vessels overland on greased logs under cover of darkness. He patrolled the walls personally, plugging breaches with whatever came to hand: barrels of dirt, shattered masonry, even prayer books. When the Ottomans tunneled beneath the defenses, he countermined, flooding their tunnels or engaging in hand-to-hand combat underground. For 53 days, his defiance turned Constantinople into a hive of improvisation, where every citizen from Venetian sailors to Greek monks became a soldier. But the true weight of Constantine's choice came in the final hours. On May 29th, the Ottomans launched their all-out assault. The emperor, clad in simple armor indistinguishable from his troops, fought on the crumbling walls until the enemy broke through. Then he did something extraordinary. He removed his imperial insignia, drew his sword, and charged into the chaos alongside his men. No one witnessed his final moments, whether he fell anonymously in the streets or drowned in the frantic retreat, but his disappearance only deepened the legend. In death, he became more than a man. He became the embodiment of a principle that some things are worth dying for, even when victory is impossible. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe, marking the end of the medieval world and the dawn of a new era. Yet Constantine's legacy outlasted the empire he couldn't save. His refusal to flee or bargain became a rallying cry for generations, inspiring everything from Russian Tsars' claims as Byzantium's heirs to the Greek War of Independence centuries later. Even maimed, the conqueror reportedly mourned him, ordering a search for his body to grant him a royal burial. Today, his name isn't just a footnote in history. It's a testament to the power of standing firm when the tides of time are against you. Because sometimes the most enduring victories aren't measured in territory held, but in the ideals that outlive the battles. Exile can break a man or forge him into something unstoppable. That's the story of Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known as El Cid, a warrior cast out by his own king, only to become the savior of a city he wasn't even born to protect. By the time he reached Valencia in 1094, he'd already lived a lifetime of battles and betrayals. Banned from Castile after a dispute with its monarch, he'd fought for both Christian and Muslim rulers, a mercenary with no kingdom to call his own. But when he laid eyes on Valencia, a glittering prize on Spain's eastern coast, he saw more than a conquest, he saw a home. And when the Almoravid armies came to take it from him, they'd learn a hard lesson. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous defender of all. What made El Cid's defense of Valencia so remarkable wasn't just his skill with a sword. It was his genius for turning weakness into strength. Outnumbered and isolated, he couldn't afford open battles. So he waged war like a shadow. His troops, a patchwork of exiled knights, local militia, and even former enemies, became masters of hit-and-run tactics. They'd ambush Almoravid supply trains under cover of fog, poison wells along their advance routes, and spread false rumors of reinforcements to sow panic. One legendary stunt involved propping up the corpses of fallen soldiers along the city walls at night, making the garrison appear twice its size by dawn. This wasn't just warfare, it was theater, and El Cid was the director, but his true weapon was loyalty, not the blind kind sworn to kings, but the kind earned through action. Unlike the nobles who discarded him, El Cid ruled Valencia alongside his wife Jimna, granting rights to Jews and Muslims alike in a rare moment of medieval tolerance. When the Almoravids offered him wealth to betray the city, he countered by paying their own troops to defect. Even in death, he won. Fatally wounded in battle, his men strapped his corpse to his horse, Babieca, and led a final charge so terrifying it routed the enemy. The message was clear. Valencia didn't need walls when it had a legend. Today, El Cid's story forces us to rethink what loyalty means. Was he a traitor for serving Muslim rulers, a hero for defending Valencia, or something more complex, a man who understood that home isn't just where you're from, but what you're willing to fight for? His tomb in Burgos bears a simple inscription. Here lies Rey Diaz, who conquered kingdoms with his sword, but his real legacy is subtler, proof that even in exile, even against impossible odds, a person can carve out their own meaning and defend it to their last breath. History remembers few women who commanded armies, shaped empires, and forged legends, but in the misty peaks of the Caucasus Mountains, one name still echoes with reverence: Queen Tamar of Georgia. Crowned in 1184, she inherited a kingdom fractured by rebellion and surrounded by enemies hungry for its riches. The nobles scoffed at the idea of a woman ruling them. Neighboring empires saw weakness where there was steel, yet by the time Tamar's reign ended, Georgia wouldn't just survive, it would thrive, stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian, a beacon of art, faith, and military might. This wasn't just defense, it was a renaissance carved into history by a queen who refused to be underestimated. What set Tamar apart wasn't just her brilliance on the battlefield, it was her understanding that true strength begins at home. Her first act, consolidating power not through brute force but through shrewd politics, she pardoned rebellious nobles, winning their loyalty by restoring lands they'd lost under her father's harsh rule. She married not for love but for strategy, first to a Russian prince to secure her northern borders, then, after divorcing him, to a dashing Ossetian warrior who became her fiercest general. Every decision was a chess move, every alliance a brick in the fortress she built around her people. And oh, how those people flourished. Tamar's Georgia became a land where poets wrote epics in candlelit monasteries, where architects designed cathedrals that seemed to touch the heavens. But this golden age wasn't built on parchment and prayer alone, it was defended by a military machine she meticulously crafted. Recognizing Georgia's rugged terrain as its greatest asset, Tamar reorganized her army into swift, mobile units that could ambush invaders in mountain passes. She fortified key roads with watchtowers that could relay smoke signals across valleys in minutes. When the Seljuk Turks, who'd once crushed her ancestors, marched on Georgia in 1203, they found not a fractured kingdom but a united front. The Battle of Bayon didn't just end in victory, it shattered Seljuk power in the region for decades. Yet Tamar's most enduring weapon was her legend. She understood that fear could guard borders as surely as swords. Rumors spread of her divine favor, of angels whispering battle plans in her dreams. Enemy commanders spoke of a queen who rode into war with a golden helm, her presence alone turning the tide. Whether these tales were true mattered less than their effect. They made her seem invincible. By the time she died in 1213, Georgia wasn't just secure, it was untouchable, a kingdom whose very name commanded respect from Constantinople to Baghdad. Today, Tamar's legacy asks us a provocative question. What does true defense look like? Is it walls and weapons, or is it the culture, unity, and myth that make a people unbreakable? She proved that the mightiest fortresses aren't made of stone, but of the stories we tell about ourselves, and the leaders bold enough to make those stories real. When poets still sing your name 8 centuries later, you didn't just defend a city, you defended the future. Blindness is supposed to be a weakness in war unless you're Jan Jizhka. By the time he lost his second eye in battle, this grizzled Czech commander had already rewritten the rules of medieval warfare. The year was 1420, and Europe had never seen anything like the Hussite rebellion. Peasants and priests rising up against the might of the Holy Roman Empire, armed with little more than farming tools and religious fury. At their head stood Jizhka, a one-eyed veteran whose battlefield innovations would make him the terror of kings. And when that last eye dimmed, something extraordinary happened. He got better. Jizhka's secret weapon wasn't sight, it was sound. Deprived of vision, he trained his ears to map battles like a bat navigating darkness. The creak of wagon wheels, the thud of hooves on different soils, even the way voices echoed off hills, all became his radar. But his real genius lay in transforming weakness into strength. The Hussites were outnumbered in every engagement, so Jizhka invented the Wagenburg, a mobile fortress of reinforced farm wagons chained together, bristling with cannons and archers. When enemies charged, these war wagons formed an instant palisade, their gaps shielded by soldiers wielding hooked polearms to drag knights from their saddles. It was medieval warfare meets MacGyver, a ragtag army turning plows into artillery. His crowning moment came at the Battle of Kutna-Hora in 1421. Trapped between two imperial armies, Jizhka ordered his wagons driven downhill at night without horses. The unmanned, lantern-lit barricades rolled straight into the enemy camp, sparking chaos as Hussite troops followed under cover of darkness. By dawn, the Holy Roman Empire's finest knights were fleeing from farmers singing hymns. This wasn't just victory, it was psychological warfare. Jizhka's blindness became his mythos. Enemies whispered he'd made a pact with darkness itself. Yet the most revolutionary thing about Jizhka wasn't his tactics, it was his vision of society. In an age when war was the sport of nobles, he built an army where blacksmiths and shepherds outranked aristocrats. Promotions came from merit, not birthright. His soldiers called him Brother Jizhka, and he repaid that loyalty by ensuring even the lowest conscript understood every maneuver. When he died of plague in 1424, his final request was to have his skin stretched over a drum so he could keep leading his troops into battle. Centuries before modern guerrilla warfare, this blind general proved that innovation and inclusion could topple empires. His legacy, a reminder that sometimes the clearest vision comes from those who see the world differently. Bayon of Burma wasn't just a conqueror, he was a master of time. By the 1550s, his empire stretched across Southeast Asia, a patchwork of kingdoms united under his banner through equal parts diplomacy and sheer force. But in 1564, as he campaigned in distant Siam, news arrived that threatened everything. His capital, Pegu, was in flames. A rebellion led by disgruntled nobles had erupted, seizing the heart of his realm while his back was turned. Most rulers would have panicked. Bayon simply turned his army around and marched 600 miles in just 35 days, through monsoon rains and treacherous terrain. That relentless pace, unheard of in his era, didn't just save Pegu, it redefined what empire building could look like. What made his response so extraordinary wasn't just speed, it was precision. While rebels celebrated their short-lived victory, Bayon's advanced scouts were already infiltrating the city, spreading rumors of his impending arrival to sow doubt. His main force moved like clockwork, with supply depots pre-stocked along their route by loyal vassals. By the time his troops reached Pegu's outskirts, the rebellion was already fracturing under the weight of his reputation alone. But Bayon didn't rely on fear to finish the job. He offered amnesty to rank-and-file rebels while executing only the ringleaders, a calculated blend of mercy and ruthlessness that crushed the uprising without breeding future resentment. Within weeks, Pegu wasn't just pacified, it was more loyal than ever. This moment revealed the duality of Bayon's genius. He could wage war on two fronts simultaneously because he understood empire as a living organism. Conquest meant nothing without stability, and stability required more than garrisons. It demanded cultural integration. His armies included Shan archers, Mon engineers, and Portuguese gunners, each group valued for their unique skills. He rebuilt Pegu's temples in styles that honored both Burmese and conquered traditions, turning the city into a symbol of unity rather than subjugation. When the rebels burned parts of his capital, they didn't just attack buildings, they attacked his life's work. That's why his response was so devastatingly personal. The legacy of Pegu's salvation lingers in Myanmar today. Bayon's ability to pivot from expansion to defense set a template for Southeast Asian kingship, one where mobility and adaptability outweighed static fortifications. But his true lesson runs deeper. Great rulers aren't just measured by the lands they take, but by the cities they refuse to lose. In the end, his empire would stretch farther than any before it, yet his legend always returns to those 35 days in 1564, when a king's love for his capital outran even the fastest rebellion. Enzinger Mband wasn't born to rule, she was born to rewrite the rules. By the time she took the throne of Ndongo in 1624, the kingdom was already buckling under Portuguese pressure. Slave raids ravaged the countryside, European forts dotted the coast, and her brother, the previous king, had died under suspicious circumstances after signing a treaty that ceded land to Portugal. Most rulers would have crumbled. Enzinger saw an opportunity. When she arrived at the colonial governor's headquarters to renegotiate that treaty, she didn't come as a supplicant, she came as an equal. The story goes that when offered only a floor mat to sit while the Portuguese governor lounged in a chair, she motioned to one of her attendants, who dropped to hands and knees to become her living throne. The message was unmistakable. No one would diminish her authority, not even the mightiest empire on earth. What followed was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. Enzinger knew her smaller forces couldn't defeat Portugal head-on, so she turned the landscape itself into an ally. She relocated her capital to the rugged cliffs of Matamba, where narrow gorges and dense foliage neutralized European cavalry advantages. She forged alliances with formerly rival tribes and even the Dutch, pitting colonial powers against each other. Her spies, often women disguised as traders, infiltrated Portuguese camps, gathering intelligence while spreading disinformation. One legendary tactic involved dressing her male warriors in women's clothing to ambush enemies who hesitated to attack what they thought was a group of harmless civilians. Every move was calculated to exploit Portuguese assumptions about African rulers, especially female ones, but Enzinger's brilliance extended beyond the battlefield. She transformed her society to sustain resistance. Recognizing that Portuguese power relied on capturing slaves, she declared Matamba a sanctuary for escaped bondsmen, swelling her ranks while crippling the colony's economy. She adopted Christianity not out of conversion but strategy, baptizing herself as Anna to negotiate with Catholic leaders on their own terms. Even in her 70s, she led troops personally. Her battle dress a blend of traditional regalia and captured European armor. When Portugal finally sued for peace in 1657, it wasn't because they defeated her, it was because after 30 years, they realized they never could. The legacy of this warrior queen shatters stereotypes. In an era when Europe painted Africa as passive and primitive, Enzinger proved otherwise. Her resistance preserved Ndongo and Matamba's independence for generations, but her true victory was symbolic. She demonstrated that colonization wasn't inevitable, that ingenuity could outmaneuver gunpowder. Today, her statue overlooks Luanda, a reminder that the fiercest defenders aren't always the strongest, but the ones who refuse to play by their enemies' rules. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or a cannon, but the unshakable will to dictate your own terms. Some leaders inherit kingdoms, others forge them from sheer defiance. That was George Castrioti, better known as Skanderbegg, the Albanian nobleman who turned rebellion into an art form. His story begins with irony. Taken as a child hostage by the Ottomans, he was raised in their courts, trained in their armies, even given the name Skanderbegg, Alexander the Lord, for his battlefield prowess. But in 1443, after 2 decades of serving the empire that had stolen his homeland, he made a choice that would shake the Balkans. With 300 loyal Albanians, he defected mid-campaign, seized the fortress of Kruja, and sent a message to Sultan Murad II that would define the next quarter century. I have not brought you freedom. I found it here among my people. What followed was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Skanderbegg knew his tiny nation couldn't match Ottoman numbers, so he turned the mountains into his greatest ally. His troops, rarely more than 10,000, became ghosts in the terrain, ambushing supply columns in narrow passes, poisoning wells ahead of enemy advances, then vanishing into cave networks known only to locals. He pioneered what modern generals would call mobile defense, abandoning indefensible lowlands to lure Ottoman forces into kill zones where their cavalry was useless. One particularly brutal winter, he even rerouted rivers to flood Turkish camps, drowning hundreds without losing a single man. But Skanderbegg's true genius lay in unity. Albania wasn't a kingdom but a patchwork of rival clans, many feuding for generations. Where others saw division, he saw potential. Traveling village to village with nothing but his charisma and a shared hatred of occupation, he brokered the League of Leisure in 1444, the first time Albanian tribes had ever sworn allegiance to a single cause. His secret, leading from the front, in battle after battle, he was the first to charge, his iconic horned helmet making him impossible to miss. When nobles questioned his orders, he'd hand them his sword and say, "You try." No one ever took him up on it. The Ottomans threw everything at him. 3 sultans, Murad II, Mehmed II, even the conqueror of Constantinople personally led campaigns against him. All failed. At the Battle of Albulina in 1457, Skanderbegg turned Mehmed's own tactics against him, using fake defectors to lure the Sultan's army into a trap that left 15,000 Ottomans dead. The victory was so complete the Vatican commissioned a fresco of it, and rumors spread that Skanderbegg had made a pact with the devil. Yet his greatest triumph wasn't on the battlefield, it was in time. For 25 years, he delayed the Ottoman conquest of Albania, buying crucial decades for Western Europe to organize against the Eastern threat. When he finally died of malaria in 1468, the Ottomans reportedly exhumed his bones to wear as talismans, such was their respect. Today, his name still rallies Albanians worldwide, proof that even against the mightiest empires, a determined few can carve out freedom. Not through numbers, but through the unbreakable will to say, "This far, no farther." The Vikings came like a storm from the north longboats, slicing up the Guadalquivir River in the summer of 971, their axes thirsty for the riches of Cordoba. The jewel of Muslim Spain, a city of scholars and poets, now faced the one threat it hadn't prepared for: seafaring raiders who struck without warning. Panic spread through the streets as the invaders sacked outskirts, burned mosques, and dragged prisoners toward their ships. But just when all seemed lost, a new force appeared on the horizon, not with the slow march of medieval armies, but with terrifying speed. At its head rode Al-Mancer, the young vizier who would become known as the Victorious, and his arrival marked the beginning of the most unconventional defense in Andalusia's history. Al-Mancer wasn't a king, but he wielded power like one. Recognizing that Cordoba's traditional armies were too slow to counter Viking hit-and-run tactics, he rebuilt the military from the ground up. His innovations read like a playbook for modern special forces: lightweight cavalry units that could cover 50 miles a day, a network of signal towers relaying messages faster than raiders could row, and elite North African archers trained to shoot from horseback at full gallop. When the Vikings returned in 979, expecting another easy prize, they found Al-Mancer waiting, not at the city gates but on their escape route. His troops had outpaced them on land, ambushing their ships at night with fire arrows. Those who survived the flames were cut down by Berber lancers in the shallows. It was the last Viking raid on Cordoba, but Al-Mancer's brilliance wasn't just in defense, it was in turning weakness into strength. Muslim Spain was fracturing internally, with regional governors chafing under central rule. Where others saw rebellion, he saw opportunity. Instead of crushing dissent, he channeled it outward, launching 57 campaigns in 27 years, not just against Christian kingdoms to the north, but against any restless Andalusi nobles itching for battle. His logic was ruthless: give potential rebels glory and plunder elsewhere, and they'll forget about revolting at home. It worked. Under his leadership, Cordoba didn't just survive, it expanded, its armies venturing as far as Santiago de Compostela, where Al-Mancer famously ordered the cathedral's bells carried back to his capital as trophies, melted down to craft lamps for its grand mosque. Yet the true measure of his legacy lies in what didn't happen. While Europe crumbled under Viking raids, Al-Mancer's reforms made Andalusia a fortress of stability. His mobile armies became a fire brigade, stamping out threats before they could spread. His spy network, disguised as merchants and pilgrims, ensured no enemy movement went unnoticed. Even his reputation became a weapon. Christian chroniclers wrote of a man so feared that mothers hushed their children with whispers of his name. Al-Mancer's story forces us to rethink what defense means. He didn't just protect walls, he protected an idea that a civilization's survival depends not on resisting change, but on riding its currents. When Vikings came, he matched their speed. When nobles grew restless, he gave them purpose, and when history handed him a fractured realm, he didn't just hold it together, he made it thrive. In the end, his greatest victory wasn't on any battlefield, but in proving that the best shields aren't made of steel, but of adaptability and relentless forward motion. Because sometimes the way to defend a city isn't to stand still, but to move faster than your enemies can think. Eric the Red didn't discover Greenland, he outlasted it. Exiled from Iceland for manslaughter in 982, the fiery-haired Viking faced a choice: flee to the unknown or perish in disgrace. What he found across the icy waters was no paradise, despite the name he'd later give it. Greenland in the 10th century was a brutal paradox: glaciers carving through valleys like axes, winters so long they blurred into years, and farmland so scarce it mocked the very idea of settlement. Yet when his ships made landfall, Eric didn't just see a refuge, he saw a challenge. And for the next 3 years, he waged a silent siege against the elements themselves, proving that the fiercest battles aren't always fought against armies, but against the indifference of the earth. What made Eric's survival so extraordinary wasn't just his toughness, it was his adaptability. Norse tradition prized cattle, but Greenland's meager pastures couldn't sustain them. So Eric did the unthinkable. He slaughtered most of his livestock, preserving only the hardiest breeds, and shifted his people's diet to seal meat and fish, a move that horrified his fellow Vikings but kept them alive. When driftwood proved too scarce for shipbuilding, he repurposed whale ribs as roof beams for longhouses. Even his famous exile became a tool. Knowing Iceland's courts would never pursue him this far, he used his outlaw status to forge his own laws, creating a society where survival trumped old-world hierarchies. By the time he returned to Iceland to recruit settlers in 985, he wasn't just selling a new home, he was selling a vision. His pitch: a land green enough to lure the desperate, yet harsh enough to filter out the weak. The colony that followed was a marvel of stubbornness. Eric's eastern settlement at Bratolith became a laboratory of Arctic survival. His wife Jodhild, a convert to Christianity, built Greenland's first church not from stone, but from turf and whalebone, a symbol of how faith too had to adapt. His son Leif would later sail even farther west, reaching Vinland, but it was Eric's groundwork that made those voyages possible. He'd turned Greenland into a supply depot where ships could overwinter, stocked with dried fish and walrus ivory to trade. For 400 years, through climate shifts and supply shortages, his descendants clung to that edge of the world, their very existence a middle finger to nature's limits. Yet Eric's ultimate legacy isn't just in the ruins of Norse Greenland, it's in the lesson he carved from ice. When faced with impossible odds, some leaders build walls. Others, like Eric, learn to live with the storm. His story asks us, what does true resilience look like? Not stubborn resistance, but the wisdom to change everything: your diet, your customs, even your name, except the will to endure. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't conquering a land, but convincing it to let you stay. Stefan Dusan didn't just rule Serbia, he redefined what it meant to be a Balkan power. Crowned emperor in 1346, he inherited a kingdom squeezed between the rising Ottoman tide to the east and the fading Byzantine Empire to the south. Most monarchs would have hunkered down behind their mountains, but Dusan saw a different path. If Serbia couldn't outlast its enemies, it would outthink them. What followed wasn't just a military campaign, it was a total reinvention of how a medieval state could defend itself, blending law, architecture, and raw ambition into an unbreakable shield. His first move was rewriting the rules, literally. The Dusan's Code, enacted in 1349, wasn't just a legal document, it was a blueprint for national resilience. By standardizing property rights, he gave peasants a stake in defending their land. By streamlining taxes, he funded a standing army instead of relying on feudal levies. And by criminalizing treason with brutal efficiency, he ensured loyalty ran deeper than fear. But the real stroke of genius, mandating that every noble's son spend time in both the army and the judiciary. Suddenly, Serbia's elite weren't just warriors, they were nation builders, equally skilled with a sword and a ledger. Then came the stones. Dusan's engineers didn't just build forts, they designed a defensive ecosystem. Along the rugged Morava Valley, watchtowers were spaced precisely at arrow-shot intervals, creating overlapping fields of fire. Mountain passes were narrowed with artificial choke points, forcing invaders into kill zones. Even monasteries doubled as strongholds, their thick walls sheltering garrisons alongside monks. The crown jewel was Skopje, his capital, where Byzantine-style double walls were reinforced with Slavic earthworks, a hybrid defense no besieger had ever faced. But Dusan's masterstroke was psychological. Knowing the Ottomans revered omens, he spread rumors of prophetic dreams where angels guarded Serbia's borders. When envoys from Sultan Orhan arrived, he received them in a hall lined with captured Byzantine banners, subtly reminding them who'd humiliated the empire they now feared. By the time of his death in 1355, Serbia wasn't just holding its ground, it stretched from the Danube to the Aegean, a realm so formidable that Venice and Hungary paid tribute just to keep its armies at bay. The lesson of Dusan's reign: true defense isn't just about repelling attacks, it's about making invasion unthinkable. His laws turned subjects into stakeholders. His forts made terrain a weapon, and his vision proved that the strongest walls aren't made of mortar, but of the collective will of a people who believe they have something worth defending. That's why, even as the Ottomans swallowed the Balkans decades later, they never forgot the emperor who showed them how much harder conquest becomes when a nation refuses to see itself as prey. Tamerlane's name still echoes across Central Asia like a thunderclap synonymous with conquest, his armies carving an empire that stretched from Delhi to Damascus. But history remembers him as the sword, rarely as the shield. Behind the tales of toppled cities and pyramids of skulls lay a ruler who understood a brutal truth: to hold an empire, you must defend it as fiercely as you build it. And in the 14th century, no one guarded their domains with quite the same lethal precision as the man-born Timur the Lame. His defensive strategy was as unconventional as his rise to power. Unlike traditional kings who relied on static fortresses, Tamerlane treated borders like living things, shifting, expanding, contracting with each threat. When the Golden Horde threatened his northern flank, he didn't wait behind walls. He lured them into the steppes, using scorched earth tactics to starve their horses, then crushed them in a battle so decisive it shattered Mongol power for generations. When rebellious Persian cities rose up, he didn't just retake them, he rebuilt their citadels with a grim innovation. Concentric walls designed so that if attackers breached the outer layer, they'd find themselves trapped in a killing zone between two rings of archers. Every victory wasn't just a display of strength, but a warning etched in stone and blood. Yet Tamerlane's real genius lay in turning defense into spectacle. Knowing fear could garrison cities better than troops, he staged elaborate demonstrations of power. After repelling an invasion by the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, he paraded captured soldiers through Samarkand's streets, not in chains, but carrying the very siege engines they'd hoped to use against him. It was psychological warfare at its most refined. Why waste men holding a city when the mere rumor of his approach could make enemies falter? Even his architecture served as deterrence. The towering Bibi-Khanum Mosque, built with bricks fired to jewel-like brilliance, wasn't just a place of worship. It was a statement that his capital's grandeur matched its impregnability. But perhaps the most revealing moment came near the end of his life. Planning an invasion of Ming China, Tamerlane ordered the construction of a massive stone fort near the Sudarya River, not as a forward base, but as a fallback point. Here was a conqueror who, for all his audacity, never forgot the fragility of empire. His death in 1405 spared China his wrath, but the lesson remained. Even history's most aggressive warmongers knew that true power isn't just taking territory, but making it unassailable. Tamerlane's legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The line between conqueror and defender often blurs. His moat was the fear he cultivated, his walls the broken armies left in his wake. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell like desert storms, he proved that sometimes the best way to protect what's yours is to make the very thought of challenging it seem like madness. And for nearly half a century, that strategy held an empire together with an iron grip no enemy dared to loosen. Richard the Lionheart stood on the sun-baked shores of Jaffa in August 1192, his chainmail glinting under the relentless Middle Eastern sun. The situation was dire. Most of his Crusader army had already sailed home, leaving him with barely 80 knights and a few hundred exhausted infantry, hardly enough to hold a city, let alone face Saladin's approaching force of 7,000 seasoned warriors. The walls of Jaffa, his last foothold in the Holy Land, lay half-ruined from previous sieges. Yet when scouts reported the Sultan's advance, Richard didn't barricade himself inside. He did the unthinkable. He formed his men into a thin line on the beach, shields locked, lances lowered, and waited. What happened next wasn't just a battle. It was a masterclass in turning desperation into legend. Saladin's mistake was underestimating the psychological power of audacity. As his troops crested the dunes, expecting to find panicked defenders scrambling for ships, they instead saw Richard's tiny force standing firm. The Lionheart himself rode down the line on his warhorse, shouting taunts in Arabic that echoed across the sand. Then came the stroke of genius. Richard ordered his crossbowmen, many of them Genos mercenaries renowned for their precision, to kneel in pairs. While one fired, the other reloaded, creating a continuous hail of bolts that shredded the first wave of Ayyubid cavalry. Saladin's generals urged a full charge, but the Sultan hesitated, unnerved by the spectacle of such defiance from so few. That hesitation cost him dearly. Richard seized the moment with the instincts of a born tactician. Spotting a gap in the enemy lines where Saladin's nephew had recklessly advanced, he led a handful of knights in a wedge charge so ferocious it split the Muslim army in two. Witnesses later swore they saw the king wield his massive Danish axe one-handed, its blade shearing through helmets and shields alike. By nightfall, Saladin's forces were in retreat, their tents abandoned, their confidence shattered. The Battle of Jaffa had lasted less than a day, but its impact would resonate for centuries. What made this victory extraordinary wasn't just the imbalance of forces, it was the sheer theatricality of Richard's leadership. He'd turned the battlefield into a stage, his every move designed to magnify his reputation as an invincible warrior. When a chronicler asked how he dared face such odds, Richard reportedly laughed and said, "Saladin learns today that lions hunt best when cornered." The line between bravery and recklessness had never seemed so thin nor so effective. Yet the true legacy of Jaffa lies in its aftermath. Though Richard couldn't retake Jerusalem, his victory forced Saladin to the negotiating table, securing Christian access to the Holy City and preserving the Crusader states for another century. More importantly, it cemented the Lionheart's legend across two worlds. Admired by Muslims for his chivalry, Saladin later sent him fresh fruit and ice during an illness, revered by Europeans as the epitome of knightly valor. In the end, Jaffa proved that the best defenses aren't always walls or numbers, but the indomitable aura of a leader who makes the impossible seem routine. Because sometimes history remembers not the battles you should have won, but the ones no one thought you could. The earth trembled under the hooves of 1,000 chariots as Boudica, queen of the Iceni, led her people toward Camulogenum, Rome's gleaming stronghold in Britain. It was the year 60, and the streets of the Roman colony still smelled of fresh mortar and arrogance. Just months earlier, this warrior queen had been flogged like a common thief, her daughters violated by occupying soldiers after her husband's death. Where others might have broken, Boudica burned. Now, with her russet hair streaming like a battle standard, she rode at the head of a rebellion that would teach Rome the cost of underestimating a woman scorned. What followed wasn't just a revolt, it was a wildfire. Boudica's forces, a coalition of Celtic tribes long chafing under Roman taxes and land seizures, swept through Camulogenum with terrifying efficiency. They left no stone standing, no Roman mouth unstopped. The 9th Legion, rushing south to quell the uprising, walked into an ambush so brutal that fewer than 100 legionaries escaped. By the time Boudica turned her sights on Londinium, the fledgling trading post had already emptied, its wealthier citizens fleeing by ship while the poor begged for mercy that never came. The Celts burned it all. Contemporary accounts describe the Thames glowing red with reflected flames, the air thick with the stench of melted Roman gold. Yet Boudica's brilliance lay not in destruction but in symbolism. Every action was a calculated insult to Roman pride. When her forces overran the temple of Claudius in Camulogenum, they didn't just loot it, they desecrated the emperor's statue, beheading it and parading the head like a trophy. She timed her attack on Verulamium to coincide with a Roman festival, ensuring maximum humiliation. Even her battle tactics inverted gender expectations. Roman historians sneered at the Celts' inclusion of female warriors until those same women proved deadlier than any legionary. This wasn't random violence, it was psychological warfare designed to shatter the myth of Roman invincibility. The rebellion's collapse at the Battle of Watling Street remains one of history's great what-ifs. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered by Governor Paulinus' disciplined troops, Boudica's forces found themselves trapped in a narrow gorge, their chariots useless. Yet even in defeat, she shaped her legend. Rather than be captured, she took poison, or so the story goes, denying Rome the spectacle of her execution. Her death scattered the rebels, but her impact lingered. the Emperor Nero, shaken by the uprising scale, briefly considered abandoning Britain altogether. Future governors learned to temper their cruelty with concessions, fearing another Boudica might rise. Centuries later, her legacy asks uncomfortable questions. Was she a bloodthirsty rebel or a freedom fighter, a failed warlord or a symbol of resistance? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that both colonizer and colonized claimed her. The Romans painted her as a barbarian queen, while Victorian Britain resurrected her as a nationalist icon. But strip away the myths, and you find a woman who refused to accept that might makes right, who proved that even the mightiest empire bleeds when pushed too far. In the end, Boudica's flame burned briefly but bright enough to scorch Rome's conscience. And sometimes that's enough. Saladin rode through Jerusalem's gates in October 1187, not as a conqueror, but as a keeper of promises. The city had fallen after 88 years of Crusader rule, its defenders exhausted, its people braced for slaughter. Yet the Sultan, who had spent decades fighting Christian knights, now faced an unexpected dilemma: how to claim victory without staining his honor. What followed would redefine the rules of war in an age known for its brutality. Unlike the bloodbath that had accompanied the Crusaders' capture of Jerusalem in 1099, Saladin's terms were startlingly humane. No massacres, no enslaved women and children paraded through the streets. Instead, he allowed safe passage for most citizens provided they paid a modest ransom. Even then, exceptions abounded. When the aged patriarch Heraclius struggled to carry the city's treasures to the ransom point, Saladin furnished him a horse. When a distraught woman begged for the return of her enslaved daughter, he freed the girl on the spot and gave them both silver for their journey. These weren't empty gestures, they were calculated acts of statecraft. By sparing Jerusalem's inhabitants, Saladin denied the Crusaders a rallying cry for revenge, while burnishing his reputation as a ruler guided by faith, not fury. But make no mistake, this mercy was also strategy. Saladin understood that holding Jerusalem required more than military might. It demanded legitimacy. His restraint contrasted sharply with the Crusaders' past atrocities, winning over local Christians who'd suffered under Frankish rule. Arab chroniclers noted how Orthodox clergy, marginalized by Latin occupiers, welcomed his troops with processions. Even his enemies grudgingly admired his conduct. The Frankish knight Ernaul, no friend to Muslims, recorded in his chronicle, "He kept his word more faithfully than many Christian princes." The true test came with Jerusalem's holy sites. Where Crusaders had converted the Dome of the Rock into a church, Saladin restored it as a mosque, yet allowed Christian pilgrims continued access to their shrine. This delicate balance between conquest and coexistence became his legacy. When Richard the Lionheart arrived 4 years later demanding the city's return, Saladin could confidently refuse. His moral high ground was as unassailable as his walls. In an era when victory was often measured in corpses, Saladin redefined triumph. His defense of Jerusalem wasn't just about holding territory. It was about proving that greatness lay not in how much you could take, but in how much you could spare. Centuries later, when Napoleon sought to charm Egypt's populace, he ordered his troops to study Saladin's example, because the surest fortress isn't made of stone, but of the stories people tell about you long after the battle's end. Vlad Dracula stood on the battlements of Ponari Castle, watching the approaching Ottoman army with cold calculation. The year was 1462, and the Sultan's forces outnumbered his own by nearly 5-1. But numbers meant nothing to the Prince of Wallachia because Vlad understood something his enemies had yet to learn. Fear could be a weapon sharper than any sword. When Mehmed II's messengers demanded tribute, Vlad's response was as subtle as a hammer strike. He nailed their turbans to their heads, What followed wasn't just a war, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare that still chills the spine 6 centuries later. His tactics defied every convention of medieval combat. Instead of meeting the Ottomans in open battle, Vlad waged a campaign of terror that turned the Carpathian Mountains into a nightmare. Forests of impaled corpses lined invasion routes, their rotting remains arranged in grotesque patterns designed to unnerve even battle-hardened janissaries. Wells were poisoned, livestock slaughtered, and villages burned, not out of cruelty but calculus. Every atrocity served a singular purpose: to make the cost of conquest unbearable. When Mehmed's army finally reached Targov East, they found the city gates wide open, its streets eerily silent. What awaited inside would haunt the Sultan's dreams for years: 20,000 impaled bodies stretching as far as the eye could see, a grotesque forest of the dead. The Ottomans retreated, their morale shattered. Yet Vlad's brutality masked a deeper brilliance. Behind the horror stories lay a ruler who transformed Wallachia from a puppet state into a sovereign power. He crushed the boyar nobility's corruption, executing dishonest officials with the same ruthlessness he showed invaders. His infamous golden cup policy, leaving a priceless chalice unattended in the town square to prove crime had been eradicated, wasn't just propaganda. It reflected his ironclad belief that stability required absolute deterrence. Even his vampiric legend served a purpose. By encouraging Europe to view him as a monster, he ensured no neighbor would risk provoking him lightly. The ethical debate surrounding Vlad remains as sharp as the stakes he favored. Was he a sadistic tyrant or a patriot forced to extremes? Modern Romania reveres him as a national hero who preserved independence against impossible odds, while Western chroniclers painted him as a bloodthirsty madman. Perhaps the truth lies in the outcomes. However horrifying his methods, they worked. Wallachia remained free during his reign, a buffer against Ottoman expansion into Europe. His reign forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. In the face of annihilation, how far is too far to defend what's yours? Because sometimes history's most effective shields aren't forged from honor, but from the willingness to become what your enemies fear most. Matilda of Tuscany rode into battle at the head of her knights, her armor gleaming under the Italian sun, an unmistakable declaration that this was no ordinary noblewoman. The year was 1077, and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV had just crossed the Alps with one goal: to crush the papal rebellion and bend the church to his will. What he hadn't counted on was the iron resolve of the woman blocking his path. At just 31, Matilda wasn't just defending her lands, she was waging a war of ideologies, proving that loyalty to the Pope could outmuscle even an emperor's ambition. Her strategy was as unconventional as her position. While most medieval lords relied on brute force, Matilda turned geography into her greatest ally. She fortified the Apennine passes with a network of stone castles: Monteveglio, Canossa, Bayonello, each positioned to control vital mountain routes. These weren't just strongholds, they were chess pieces on a board she designed. When Henry's forces advanced, they found roads blocked, supply lines severed, and garrisons harassed by Matilda's light cavalry. She'd learned warfare not from books, but from childhood summers spent touring her father's fortifications, absorbing every lesson about choke points and sightlines. Now, those lessons became the emperor's nightmare, but castles alone couldn't win a war. Matilda's true genius lay in her alliances. She leveraged her vast wealth. Tuscany was the economic heart of medieval Italy, to bankroll papal loyalists across Europe. Her court became a hub for reformers, a place where bishops and scholars plotted resistance over fine Venetian wine. Even her marriage, though short-lived, was strategic. wedding the teenage Duke Godfrey, the Hunchback of Lorraine, tied northern Italy to the Rhineland's military might. When Henry retaliated by declaring her titles forfeit, she turned excommunication into a weapon, rallying clergy to portray the emperor as a tyrant. Every move was calculated to fracture his support while cementing her image as Christendom's shield maiden. The defining moment came at Canossa in 1077. Henry, humiliated by Matilda's guerrilla campaigns, stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days begging Pope Gregory VII's forgiveness. What's often forgotten is whose castle hosted this historic humiliation Matilda's. Her fortress wasn't just a backdrop, it was a stage she'd set, a physical reminder that even emperors knelt at her gates. The scene sealed her legend, a woman who'd outmaneuvered the most powerful man in Europe without drawing her sword. Yet Matilda's legacy isn't just in battles won. She redefined what power looked like in a man's world. Fluent in Latin and German, she corresponded with scholars as equals. She commissioned illuminated manuscripts that depicted her not as a delicate noblewoman, but as a warrior enthroned. When she died in 1115, she left her lands not to a husband or son, but to the church, a final act of defiance against those who thought women couldn't wield sovereignty. Centuries later, Napoleon would loot her tomb not out of spite but fascination. Even he recognized what Henry learned too late. Some fortresses aren't made of stone, but of the will of those who refuse to be conquered. Genghis Khan's name still conjures images of thundering cavalry and cities reduced to ash, but history often overlooks his most surprising legacy, the man who made the Silk Road safer than ever before. In the early 13th century, the famed trade routes connecting Europe to Asia had become a no-man's land of bandits and warlords, where caravans risked everything for a chance at profit. Then came the Mongol unification, and with it, an irony that would reshape the world. The same conqueror who raised civilizations also became their unlikely guardian, turning chaos into an era of unprecedented exchange. His methods were as ruthless as they were effective. Where previous rulers had tolerated local raiders, Genghis imposed a simple, brutal rule: attack a merchant, and his army would hunt you down like a wolf chasing wounded prey. Mongol patrols, mounted on swift steppe ponies, enforced a Pax Mongolica so absolute that travelers boasted they could carry a sack of gold from Beijing to Baghdad without fear. The infamous Yam courier system, a network of relay stations spaced a day's ride apart, did more than speed military orders. It became the backbone of secure trade, with merchants using the same routes to transport silk, spices, and ideas. For the first time in centuries, a Venetian trader could share a meal with a Chinese scholar in Samarkand, their conversation unfolding under the protection of the Great Khan's laws. But this wasn't altruism, it was genius. Genghis understood that wealth flowed where swords kept it safe. By taxing trade instead of plundering it, he filled his coffers without lifting a blade. Cities that surrendered peacefully, like Bukhara and Nishapur, found themselves thriving as never before, their bazaars stocked with goods from continents once deemed unreachable. Even his descendants expanded on this vision. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty printed paper currency accepted from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, while the Golden Horde's capital, Sarai, became a melting pot where Persian poets debated with Russian princes. The real testament to this system, its collapse proved its worth. When the Mongol Empire fractured in the 14th century, the Silk Road splintered with it, plunging back into chaos. Pirates overran land routes, tariffs multiplied, and the Black Death exploited broken supply chains to ravage Eurasia. Centuries later, when European explorers like Columbus sought new paths to Asia, they weren't just chasing spices, they were chasing the ghost of Genghis' stability. So was the Scourge of God also its guardian. Perhaps the answer lies in the long caravan trails that still bear his imprint, because sometimes the fiercest defenders aren't those who build walls, but those who tear down barriers, leaving behind not ruins but roads. Robert the Bruce knelt in the muddy fields of Bannockburn, his fingers tracing the rough hilt of his sword as dawn broke over the Scottish hills. It was June 23, 1314, and the air hummed with the tension of 8,000 Scots facing twice their number in English knights. This wasn't just another battle, it was the defining moment of a king who'd spent 20 years fighting not just for a crown, but for the very idea of Scotland. And in a few hours, he would prove that sometimes the fiercest defense isn't just holding ground, it's refusing to let a nation's spirit be broken. Bruce's path to Bannockburn was paved with setbacks that would have shattered lesser men. After murdering his rival John Comyn in 1306, he'd been excommunicated by the Pope and hunted by Edward I's armies. At one point, he'd fled to the Hebrides, hiding in caves while English patrols scoured the countryside. Legend claims he watched a spider try again and again to spin its web, failing 6 times before succeeding on the 7th, a moment that steeled his resolve. Whether the story's true or not, the lesson was, Bruce turned survival into strategy. By the time Edward II marched north in 1314, the Scottish king had transformed guerrilla raids into a full-blown rebellion, systematically reclaiming castles not through brute force, but by starving out garrisons and burning fortifications to deny their use to the English. Bannockburn itself was a masterpiece of tactical innovation. Bruce knew his spearmen couldn't match English cavalry in open combat, so he turned the terrain into a weapon. The boggy ground near the Bannockburn stream, chosen deliberately, neutralized the charge of heavy knights, their horses sinking into the mire. His schiltrons, tight formations of pikemen, became human fortresses, their bristling spears impaling overconfident horsemen. When the English longbowmen tried to break the Scottish lines, Bruce unleashed his hidden reserve of light cavalry, a move as unexpected as it was devastating. But the real stroke of genius was psychological. As the battle raged, a distant dust cloud appeared, Scottish camp followers, waving banners to mimic reinforcements. The English faltered, then broke. By day's end, Edward fled for his life, his army shattered, his father's dream of subduing Scotland buried in the mud alongside thousands of his men. Yet Bruce's triumph wasn't just in winning the battle, it was in what came after. Unlike rebel leaders who fade post-victory, he cemented independence through shrewd statecraft. The Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, a letter to the Pope signed by Scottish nobles, didn't just assert sovereignty, it framed Scotland's cause as divinely ordained, declaring that as long as 100 Scots lived, they'd never bow to English rule. Bruce even leveraged his excommunication into a bargaining chip, promising papal loyalty in exchange for recognition. When Edward III finally signed the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, it wasn't just peace, it was validation. The legacy of Bannockburn echoes far beyond medieval Scotland. Bruce proved that national identity isn't given, it's forged in the willingness to endure. His story asks us, what does true defense look like? Is it walls and treaties, or the unyielding belief that some lines in the earth and the human heart should never be crossed? Because sometimes the most enduring victories aren't written in ink or stone, but in the stubborn refusal to let a people's story end. From Baldwin IV's masked charge against Saladin to Robert the Bruce's muddy triumph at Bannockburn, one thread binds these 20 defenders across time and terrain, their refusal to let circumstance dictate destiny. These weren't just warriors, they were alchemists of adversity, turning desperation into innovation, fear into fuel, and what should have been defeats into legends that outlived empires. Think about that for a moment. Every city saved, every invasion thwarted, began with a single person's decision to stand when others would have knelt. That's the real lesson here, not that history favors the brave, but that bravery itself can bend history. Consider the tools they wielded beyond swords and shields. Jizhka used blindness as a tactical advantage, his ears mapping battlefields like sonar. Enzinger embanned weaponized perception, dressing warriors in women's clothes to exploit enemy hesitation. Skanderbegg transformed mountain passes into natural kill zones, while Sid's corpse led a final charge strapped to his horse. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were masterclasses in reimagining limitations as opportunities. It begs the question, what might we overcome if we stopped seeing obstacles as roadblocks and started treating them as raw material? But the deepest resonance of these stories lies in their humanity. These defenders weren't mythical demigods, they were flawed, flesh and blood people. Baldwin's body betrayed him with leprosy. Matilda of Tuscany faced scorn as a woman in a man's world. Vlad Dracula's brutal tactics alienated allies even as they terrified enemies. Their greatness wasn't in perfection, but in persistence. Joan of Arc didn't know military theory, she knew conviction. Constantine XI could have fled Constantinople. Instead, he chose to die anonymously in the streets alongside his people. That's the heart of true leadership, not titles or armor, but the willingness to bleed for something bigger than yourself. So what do we take from these echoes across centuries? That walls matter less than willpower, that the most formidable fortress isn't made of stone, but of the stories we tell ourselves about what's possible. Whether you're facing personal struggles or societal challenges, remember, the defenders of history didn't wait for perfect conditions, they created them. Now it's your turn. Which of these voices from the past will whisper to you in your moments of doubt? Will it be Baldwin's refusal to let illness define him? Boudica's fiery resolve against injustice, or perhaps Stefan Dushan's reminder that systems, not just swords, shape survival. As the dust settles on these tales, we're left with more than just admiration. We're left with a challenge, to live with the same clarity of purpose that guided these defenders when their worlds hung in the balance. Because while our battles may look different, the stakes are no less real. The preservation of what we hold dear, the courage to innovate when tradition fails, and the quiet heroism of enduring when all seems lost. So tell us in the comments whose story ignited something in you, and if you've ever faced your own siege, how did you rise to meet it? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most game-changing moments. Until next time, stand firm.